Good to go? Okay. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. That's for those who are coming in from out of town. That's one of, after the museum, one of the big reasons to come to New Orleans, of course. This morning we talked a good bit about Airpower. We had some good bait an appetizer to lead us into this discussion now, while the bombing of Caen is still fresh in our minds. The next panel is going to discuss the significant role Allied air power played in the Normandy campaign. Chairing the session today is Dr. Robert Hutchinson. Rob is an assistant professor of strategy and security studies at the Air Force School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, where he teaches courses on military history, strategy, irregular warfare. His research focuses on the 20th century European political and military history, intelligence studies, Holocaust, and genocide studies. With that, take it away, Rob.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for coming back for this panel. I'm very excited for it, and thank you, Pete, for the very nice introduction. You're not here to see me talk, so I'm going to very briefly introduce my two colleagues and then let them take the floor. But since all three of us are Air Force, all three of us work for the Air Force, so we should get the obligatory out of the way that we speak for no one but ourselves and so forth and et cetera. That's the joking, not joking thing that we say. So with that being said, we heard a lot today about perspectives on the D-Day invasion, both kind of expected and unexpected. And so one thing to keep in mind as we consider air power and its contribution to D-Day is the fact that air power, much like the story of the land advance, is a human story, right? With individuals grappling with new technologies and trying to apply them in circumstances that are both expected and unexpected in a rapidly changing environment. And so I'm very excited to hear the remarks from our two panelists today. To my immediate right is Dr. Tom Hughes, who is a colleague of mine at the U.S. Air Force School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. He and Brian Lasley to my far right, there's a lot more about their bios in the program. I want to get right to it. But they are both distinguished scholars of air power who have very interesting presentations teed up for us today. So with that being said, gentlemen, take it away.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. You don't have to be much of a museum person or much of a historian to know this place is first rate. And that's as true behind the scenes as it is in their public-facing posture here at the museum. I want to thank the museum for inviting us down and treating us so well. Delight to be here, delight to share the stage with people I admire and respect. And I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the 9th Air Force and its support in the American sector. I'd like to do this conversationally and casually, but with some forethought. I want to get the 9th Air Force to England. I want to get them situated there and established before D-Day. And then I want to just tell three very short little stories that I think exemplify some of the ways in which tactical air power contributes to the Normandy operations from about the 6th of June to the breakout stage in late July. A story about interdiction, a story about the airfields that Steve talked a little bit about this morning. I want to expand on that. And then a story about the development of close air support, or armored column cover. And that's very simply what I'm going to try to do. Getting the 9th Air Force to England was a Herculean task. The 9th Air Force exists in North Africa during the North African campaign, but only the name and about 12 people come with the 9th Air Force to England in the fall of 1943. The other 230,000 members of the 9th Air Force, and it'll number that many by June 6, largest numbered Air Force in the world, larger than the 8th Air Force by about 30,000 people, will come directly from the States. They'll be relatively green, and they're going to have a steep learning curve. And you can track that learning curve through these 3 stories. Because the Air Force comes to the war as such a new and adolescent, if you're stretching it, organization, they don't have a lot of bureaucratic underpinnings. They don't have a lot of bureaucratic scaffolding around which they can translate lessons, help the right hand know what the left hand is doing, lessons that might have been picked up in North Africa or George Kenney's 5th Air Force in the Pacific. Don't get translated laterally very well. Some of the speakers have talked about the things that they learned in earlier operations, and that's true to some extent with the Tactical Air Forces, but it's actually more impressive how much they don't know what the other units are doing. And so there's a learning curve that goes on in these 3 stories. Some of the people, I just want to, Rob's point about this being a people story, from this side of that, from your left to your right, that's the guy in the middle of that picture, flanked by Louis Brereton and Dwight Eisenhower's Pete Quesada. I'm going to generally tell this story through his eyes. He's the 9th Fighter Command commander. Louis Brereton is the 9th Air Force commander. He's the NAF commander. Quesada has the fighter bombers. And of course, you know who Dwight Eisenhower is. Dwight Eisenhower knows who Pete Quesada is. That top picture is Pete Quesada joyriding with Eisenhower on the 1st of July at a conference. Eisenhower wants to see what this increasing bottleneck, I'll talk about in a minute, looks like. So they get in a P-51. They don't want to draw too much attention to them. There's just one other plane with them, and they're driving around. That earns a personal rebuke to both of them by the President of the United States. So they have that distinction. Below is Quesada and O.P. Weiland. O.P. Weiland becomes George Patton's close air support commander and helps George Patton become George Patton. The other Tactical Air Force commander with the fighter bombers is a guy named Richard Nugent. You heard a little bit about him earlier today. His claim to fame is he is the great uncle of the rocker Ted Nugent. Someone once told me in a conversation like this, a story like this, a presentation like this, try to give them something they might remember the next day. So there. Uncle Richard Nugent. The picture over on the far side is one of my favorites. That's Pete Quesada with a pointer. The other man standing is Joseph Collins. And these 2 men are outlining the scheme that you heard a little bit about earlier today about the air support for the assault on Cherbourg. Sitting down is Jimmy Doolittle, kind of hunched over. Right behind his shoulder is Carl Spaatz. The guy leaning in the back is Hoyt Vandenberg. These airmen are some of the airmen that are going to sort of bring the 9th Air Force to the far shore. In Pete Quesada's own little 9th Fighter Command, which will number about 35,000 people by D-Day, but which numbers him and another person on November 17th, will get their first fighter bomber group, the 354th, the Pioneer Mustang group, the first group in Europe with the Mustang, on November 20th. And they will be very, very busy in the months leading up to the invasion. So too will the 9th Troop Carrier Command, the C-47s, the transport people. So too will the 9th Medium Bomber Command. So too will the 9th Engineering Command, the single largest component of the 9th Air Force, 70,000 men strong. And for D-Day, for the men of the 9th Air Force, it's a big day. And you can get that in their unit histories. You can understand that they know something important is happening. It is also, though, another day of operations, because they had been doing this stuff since the first time they showed up. For the ground forces, that is the day. That's the day this all begins. Not so true with the 9th Air Force. 230,000 troops on June 6, 1944. 3 little stories about the ways in which this 9th Air Force participates and helps the fight onto the far shore. The first story actually begins before the fight begins on June 6th. Interdiction. interdicting the battlefield, isolating the battlefield. That map, I don't have a pointer, but you see on the top of the map, you can kind of track the Seine River. And the Seine is well known enough, and you can kind of see Paris, and that's where all the towns are and stuff. And the Seine River is winding its way inland to France. The river on the bottom of the map, the long river on the bottom of the map, is the Loire. And if you take a look at the Normandy battle space, and you take a look at those two rivers, you understand that if you can interdict those two rivers, you can interdict a great deal of the Normandy battle space. The problem is, if you do this too well and too diligently and in too focused of a manner, your enemy is going to figure out where you're going to land, because they are no smarter nor no dumber than you are. And Rick Atkinson talked a little bit last night about Operation Fortitude and this deception plan that the British and the Americans are actually going to come across the Pas de Calais, across from the Straits of Dover. And that's what we want the Germans to think we are coming. So beginning about the 1st of May, when they start to get really interested in this interdiction, for every interdiction mission that is flown along those riverways and trying to take out bridges, the top picture is actually a taken out bridge in the town of Rouen. You can't really see it too well, but in the background you can see the famous spire of the Rouen Cathedral. The bottom picture is a bridge collapsed on the Loire. For every mission that's flown trying to interdict those rivers, 3 missions are going to be flown in the Pas de Calais. For every mission that's actually going to have a tactical effect, 3 are flown somewhere else. About the middle of May, that ratio becomes 2 to 1. About the 1st of June, that ratio becomes 1 to 1. And they don't stop flying these deception missions in the Pas de Calais until the Germans begin moving all of their units in the Pas de Calais into the Normandy battle area, which is about June 19th. So for a fortnight, even after the invasion, as long as they think they are holding in place German defensive units outside of the battle area, the Americans and the British are going to fly interdiction missions somewhere else. Fortitude is an amazing deception plan. It's incredible. Most of Fortitude is fake. George Patton's fake army, the cardboard and plywood tanks, the fake radio traffic. It's a magic trick that could be found out. These interdiction missions are real. Real planes, real bombs, real people, real gas, real lives, including a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Leon Vance. If you're from Oklahoma or you know the Air Force defense posture today, Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma is named after that man. He will lose his life commanding a B-17 on one of these deception interdiction missions in the Pas de Calais and earn the Medal of Honor in the process. This part of the interdiction plan buys for Fortitude its authenticity that could not have been bought anywhere or any other way. All of the other stuff could have been figured out. But the interdiction part of Fortitude was real. Once you get to the far shore, you begin thinking about how to actually interdict the German forces that are coming into the battle space. Picture of rail lines, marshalling yards. It's an interesting picture. It doesn't reproduce very well. That's actually a target folder picture from a debrief of one of the 4 missions that the medium bombers of the 9th Air Force fly at Pas de Calais. I mean, not Pas de Calais, Pointe de Hoc, the battery there. Famous story about the Rangers attacking that point. Of course, the Rangers get up to that point in an incredible story that's well known, and they find that the guns aren't even in those batteries. They had been moved back a couple of kilometers, and they had been moved back a couple of kilometers because of these air missions, 4 of them before the invasion. And that is part of the story of the effect that interdiction will have, the effect of dropping all of the bridges. If you take a river cruise today from Paris down the Seine to the English Channel, and you can see them. It's a popular vacation to take. The museum runs staff rides that way. You will not, once you get outside the environs of Paris, sail under a bridge older than 80 years old, because they're all gone. So too with the Loire. George Patton, in his famous Breakout, will talk about O.P. Weiland's interdiction of that riverway and say that O.P. Weiland's airplanes were worth a full corps in the United States Army on the ground. And part of that was geography, but part of that was the careful way in which the American planners spend resources on missions that will never, ever, ever have any tactical meaning, but have immense operational and strategic meaning by holding in place, particularly the panzer divisions near the Pas de Calais. That is one small little story. Airfields. Again, the map doesn't really relate. All those little dots on that airfield are some of the more than 200 airfields that are built or maintained or reclaimed from the Germans during the entire campaign. In Normandy itself, there are 14, and then there are another 4 emergency landing strips that are built. The very first one, by the end of D+1, June 7th, behind Utah Beach as an emergency landing strip. Steve talked a little bit about the 9th Engineering Command, 70,000 people strong. There are 700 of them on Utah the night of June 6th, and they're hacking away an emergency landing strip that is first used the following night. These airfields eventually occupy most of the graded real estate in Normandy by the early part of July. If you go to the Omaha Cemetery today and look across the draw on either immediate sides, and if the trees weren't there, and they weren't then, you would be looking at 2 airfields. If you go to the battery at Longnes-sur-Mer, the German battery, one of the very few larger German artifacts still along the Atlantic shore there, and get on top of one of those gun emplacements, you would be able to see 3 landing fields. If you go to the radar museum site at Douvres, which is in the British sector, which is by design on high ground, it's a German radar, you would see 5. They're everywhere. For a while, in a couple of P-47 groups of Peak Casada, when they come to the far shore, some wits were taking rear light blinkers from British automobiles and putting them on the rear tails of their planes and making them operative, because the air traffic was kind of a joke, but the evasive action or deconfliction was as simple as a blinker light. And they actually you can see pictures of these blinker lights, these automobile blinker lights on the planes, until people in the engineering command said, you know, having 2 different electrical systems on a plane is probably not a good idea, and yeah, funny, get those off. Pictures of the airfields. The one on the bottom right, as I'm looking, is a emergency landing strip, mostly dirt, entirely dirt, covered with what, for lack of a better description, would be heavy gauge chicken wire today. Up until 10 or 15 years ago, it wasn't hard to find this chicken wire on farmers' fence fields in Normandy. It's getting harder and harder to find, actually. I used to be able to find them pretty easy when I'm bringing a group of people around and point it out. It's harder and harder. That was for the fighters. That was for the lighter planes. You have this heavier steel planking on the other picture on the bottom, although that's a fighter plane sitting there. That was for the medium bombers that needed a little more time and space. As they get further infield, inland, they are reclaiming old German airfields. That's a German airplane wreck in the foreground and a P-38 in the background there. These airfields in Normandy have a design life of about 6 weeks. They're not designed to last forever. They're chicken wire and tar paper. And they need to break out beyond or inside of that time period. Otherwise, the logistics of the airfields are going to begin to degrade. In the early part of July, that is beginning to happen to the earliest fields, and it's going to continue to happen. And there's no other real estate to put these fields. It just doesn't exist. When Omar Bradley first writes a note to Dwight Eisenhower on July 10th and says, I don't know if we can hang on, and he hadn't said that since the very first day at Omaha, when they wondered whether they need to pull back from Omaha. He's talking about airfields. He's not talking about food. He's not talking about guns or bullets. These airfields are going to fall apart. Already, the 9th fighter bombers that are in these airfields have a maintenance deficiency of about 40% because there's so much debris and dust and dirt being kicked up on these airfields when these planes are taxiing around. 2 squadrons have repatriated back to their home fields in Middlewallop in England. If they all go home to England, you're going to have a real problem. And it's a real concern. As it turns out, and Brian's going to talk a little bit about breakout in late July, that happens just in a nick of time. But because it is typically underappreciated, I think, and I think Steve made the same point this morning, the engineering command, the aviation battalions, play a critical role in this story in getting an expeditionary air force to the far shore, increasing the combat effectiveness of an airplane by about 4 times, because they don't have to fly across the English Channel to get to where they're going and lawyer to what they're going to try to do, is an incredible story. It's actually a story that is important to this day as we think about expeditionary airfields on second and third island chain defensive lines in the Pacific, and how to get there and maintain that. And the lessons from this story are, I actually know they're being looked at. They're being looked at. How do they do this? What did they do? How do they design these things? It's an incredible story, and they don't get enough credit, this whole airfield story. Close air support armored column cover. This is in some ways where the learning curve is the easiest to see. This is a Air Force that was about 125,000 men strong in 1940 and will be 2 million strong by 1944. And it is just so hard for everybody in that organization to know what everybody else has been learning along the way. And the 5th Air Force of George Kenny in the Pacific, and the 13th Air Force of Nathan Twining in the Pacific, and the 12th Air Force of Joe Cannon in Italy, the 9th Air Force of Pete Casada, of Louis Brereton in Normandy, are kind of learning as they go. It's pretty interesting in organizational theory to see the solutions these people come up with, because they're very similar to the very similar kinds of problems, but they don't know what everybody else is doing. Because there's not a lot of pre-war doctrine and thought about this. There's a great deal of pre-war doctrine and thought about strategic bombing and that kind of stuff. The picture to the bottom, and as I look at it to the right, that is the Air Control Center on D-Day itself. 13,000 sorties on D-Day. Most of them are planned. A lot of them are 8th Air Force. Many of them are 9th Air Force. A lot of them are British 2nd Tactical Air Force. There is a scheme for close air support call missions on D-Day. There are 13 of them flown. None of them matter. They happen hours after the request was made. The communication system collapses. Think of a web page that crashes today, when everybody tries to go on at the same time. It's too bulky, it's too cumbersome. They try to make it as robust as they possibly can. They're at the front end of a learning curve and failing. 13 missions of 13 sorties of 13,000 sorties, and none of them have any bearing on the battlefield. That's got to get better. The picture in the middle on the bottom is one of 13 communication relay stations that the 9th Air Force will eventually establish in Normandy. Those are wires, and that's actually each of these 13 have 4 of those trucks, and all those wires come in and out of it. They're trying to make more robust the communication system. Close air support is going to be about as good as the communications that exist between a ground unit and an air unit. That's its limb fact. And they're trying to figure out how to do this. The top picture there, you can see the panels. They sometimes mark the ground. That's a bomb line marker, those 9 white panels there on the ground. They're actually red in the American sector and pink in the British sector. From the air, maybe looking pretty much the same. But it still takes too long to get these messages to the people that need it. You've heard a lot about the bocage and the very tough German defensive posture. And an air support mission that doesn't happen inside of about 30 or 45 minutes from a call from a ground unit for support is probably not going to be very effective. And it takes much longer than that, probably about 3 hours. Now they're trying to get what we would call today the kill chain, that sort of gap between a request and an action. 2 hours, 90 minutes. Gets a little better, it gets a little better, it gets a little better. But human communication starts to get in the way. Tank commander might say, there's a German machine gun nest in that church steeple that looks like a red roof, 2 kilometers that way. Well, from the air at 200 knots, there's about 50 church steeples that all look the same, and they need better ways to communicate in the ways in which an air person would understand. And they need to do it quicker. And they need to have more instantaneous communication between that tank guy and that pilot. And through a long series of trial and error, they eventually decide to put, lo and behold, an aviation radio in a tank. And so an individual tank commander can talk technically to an individual aircraft commander. This is a cultural sea change for both of these organizations because it requires more senior officers to get the hell out of the way and not filter the information, not say, oh, that's a reasonable target, or that's a good use of the asset. And that's hard for people to do. That's hard for more senior people to do. It's hard for us to do in our own daily lives if we think we have an expertise and a competence about something to sort of get out of the way and say to that 18-year-old and that 22-year-old, you guys figure it out. Still, hey, that steeple over there, get that one. So Cassata and Omar Bradley, the first Army commander, and they are side by side separated only by a bocage so that a bomb wouldn't take both of them out. Hey, let's put either tank commanders in airplanes, but there's just no room for that. There's not much room in a tank, but they could skinny in a pilot so that they can talk to each other in the same language. Cassata doesn't want to order this. He wants this to happen. He could order pilots into tanks. He didn't want to do that. So he kind of, his first offer is 24-hour, for a 2-week tour. They do this for 2 weeks. His first offer is a day pass in London, 24 hours. That's not the right price point. 48 hours. That's still not going to get the house sold. As it turns out, 72 hours, 3 days in London is the right price point, and he starts to get pilot. Oh, I'll do that for 2 lousy weeks and live not in a nice little Air Force encampment, but in a tank. And that develops armored column cover, which becomes very critical in the breakout because finally an individual tank can talk in near real time with an individual pilot, majors, lieutenant colonels, generals, sit on their hands enough, and they can communicate in ways that they understand. And so that bottom picture is an individual tank passing by an individual German armored vehicle that has been taken out by armored column cover moments before. It's not these big, huge, bombing fields, not these big, the whole river network interdicted. They have to get into the smallness of the battle space to make this thing work. And they have to overcome some cultural obstacles. They have to learn. They have to ride this learning curve. And they do it, and it becomes very, very important in the breakout stage because there's 2 armored column cover in Joe Collins's corps that are going to break out and help Patton become Patton. And there are planes above both of them. And it's an important part of the ways in which the tactical air forces help the Normandy invasion. 3 small little stories that I hope exemplify a little bit. And I'm happy to expand, talk more about them if you have any questions about them. When you think about the Normandy Air Campaign, and you think about Airpower's role in it, and there's a lot of shortcomings, and you've heard some about them. Rob Citino's point about he feels sorry for the Air Forces because they're asked to do something that they're not really trained and equipped to do. If you actually look at the CEP accuracy, circle area probable, the sort of statistical measure that we use today to determine whether or not a bombing run is accurate or not, the CEPs of the 8th Air Force bomb runs are actually pretty good, given what they're trained to do. So they're not ready to do these things. The classic conventional wisdom of an amphibious operation is, getting ashore, that first couple of, that's the hard part. If you can get ashore and dig in, and that's the operational objective, you heard from the session right before this, that the operational objective in the British sector isn't really to take Caen that day. That's aspirational. It's to get on the shore and be able to stay there. The Allies do that reasonably well. It's the weeks afterward where it becomes really hard. This tough German defensive crust sort of settles in, and you can't get past that, and you're stalemated to the point that Omar Bradley, by early July, is saying, I'm going to have to move my air forces back to England, and then I have only about 1/4 of the combat effectiveness of those air forces. When you think about how close run this thing is, it's hard to think about the success of Normandy without air power helping it along. It's not the only determinative cause. Not on the day 1 or day 2 or day 3, but on day 12, day 14, day 17, when you are really sort of settling in to a stalemated situation. The German effectiveness of forces that they move into Normandy as an aggregate, the division aggregate effectiveness is degraded by about 45%. By Allied interdiction before they even meet an Allied soldier. So it doesn't turn amphibious operation conventional wisdom on a head, but it modifies it. That air power's contribution is really in the 2 fortnights after, or 3 fortnights after, and then going and continuing on. 3 little stories about the 9th Air Force and its role in the Normandy air operations. There's more. Happy to talk about more. Happy to be here. Thanks for coming.
Well, I apologize. I was so excited to turn it over to our panelists that I bungled my lines initially. That was my esteemed colleague, Tom Hughes. This is my esteemed colleague, Brian Lasley, who I never told you where he's from. He's the command historian at the Air Force Academy.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Let me echo all of my colleagues by saying thanks to the museum for having us. Thanks for bringing us down here. And we all, every one of us, thank the museum because we want to come back because we like it here. Now, I've been a historian as a career, and when I say that, that means someone pays me to do this for about 15 years. Now, much like everyone else in the room, history has been a passion of mine for much longer than that, going back to my childhood. I'm just lucky enough to be that 10-year-old that got to turn a passion into an actual career. And to realize that I am not much different than that 10-year-old. I did make an impulse purchase in the gift shop. I could not resist owning one of the famous airborne clickers. If my wife is watching, I'm sure she's going to be very excited about me bringing this home. Now, air power is different, and the way that we talk about air power is different. I want to point out that none of the other historians here have stood up and said, I am a land power historian. Yeah, I study it. It doesn't need to be said. But air power historians are very passionate about saying, I am an air power historian. Now, one of my favorite movies growing up was The Longest Day, and I can still remember the commercials. These were the commercials that came on when you were watching WTBS and watching the Atlanta Braves or old reruns of the Andy Griffith Show, and the Longest Day commercial would come on. I'll never forget, it was the beginning of the end of World War II. And so to be at the National Museum of World War II talking about air power in this room in particular is something of a full circle moment for me. Now, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Hughes, and we always use esteemed colleague, I use it very loosely. Dr. Hughes is a man that I deeply respect, whom I read in grad school. So I am using the term colleague very, very loosely with him, at least for me. But he closed with, given its close run, difficult to imagine a successful invasion of Western Europe without effective air support following 6 June and across the summer of 1944. So he talked about 9th Air Force. I am going to go back and talk about 8th Air Force. Now, it's been a great year for those of us who study air power. And at the top of that list has to be Apple TV's Masters of the Air. This is, of course, ends the trilogy of Band of Brothers and the Pacific. And when HBO released Band of Brothers over 20 years ago now, the first 2 episodes actually came out on September 9th, 2001. So when Band of Brothers is released that Sunday night, we're less than 48 hours from the events of September 11th. Now, when that comes out in 2001, it had only been 57 years since the events they were talking about. And if you watched Band of Brothers, you'll recall that at the beginning of each episode or the end of each episode, you actually got to hear from the veterans themselves talk about the events that were in that particular episode. Of course, this was not possible for Masters of the Air, which comes out now 80 years later. And I do ponder how members of the Bloody Hundredth, Buck Clevin, Bucky Egan, Rosie Rosenthal might have reacted to having themselves portrayed in a miniseries. And I also want to point out that this is a show that I watched fairly religiously, and not only because obviously I wanted to watch it, but my 14-year-old daughter wanted to watch it as well. Now, I don't think she was as interested in the air power aspects of the show. It happened to star one of her favorite actors, Austin Butler. So when my 14-year-old comes to me and says, "Will you watch this show with me?" Obviously, yes. This is not a big ask for me. Now, the show itself actually kind of skips over the events of D-Day. In the penultimate episode, Captain Crosby spends 72 hours straight planning the missions for D-Day and after. He works himself into a stupor. He eventually passes out, and he misses D-Day. He sleeps through everything on June 6th. Now, if you're active on social media, which I don't know how many of you are, there was a bit of an uproar over this particular episode because it did not cover D-Day. There were actually people upset. You can't not cover D-Day. But the events actually mirror Crosby's memoir on a Wing and a Prayer. So what I want to do today is obviously talk about what 8th Air Force did on D-Day and in the days following that. So, real quick background on the 8th. 8th Air Force begins its operations in August of 1942 under the command of Ira Aker, the man on the left there. And Aker's going to oversee the establishment and the expansion of 8th Air Force until he runs afoul of the head of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold. Now, this is not the only incident in which Arnold does this. If you did not satisfy Hap Arnold, you would rapidly find yourself out of a job. So in late 1943, after having spent over a year building and expanding and getting 8th Air Force to where it could do what he wanted it to do, Aker is relieved. He's actually promoted. He's promoted out of 8th Air Force. And Jimmy Doolittle comes in to take over in early 1944. But the story of the 8th and what the 8th wanted to accomplish is way older than 1942 or 1943. We're going to have to go back decades. We're going to have to go all the way back to the First World War, and we're going to have to see just how terrible trench warfare is for air power thinkers in the interwar period to go, there has to be a better way. There has to be a way to go over and not through, all right? Everything that the 8th Air Force, and really all Allied air forces do in the Second World War, is predicated upon this idea of not repeating the trench warfare mistakes of World War I. Now, air power pioneers in the 20s and 30s, they kind of take it to the next level, though. They approach bombardment with a religious fervor, all right? And they come up with the doctrine of high-altitude precision daylight bombing, all right? And all air leaders, particularly Spats, felt that any sortie that's not being used to do this high-altitude precision, deep strike, long-range bombing is a mistake, all right? Because if we do this bombing, if we hit the war-making effort of the enemy, the war is going to be over that much sooner. So leave us alone. Don't ask us to do tactical stuff. Let us go over, not through. We will end the war. In fact, I think Spats even thinks he can do it in the war without the need for an invasion of Europe. So let's look at the sheer size of 8th Air Force. Now, on 30 May 1944, the final bomb group stands up just in advance of the Normandy invasion, bringing the total to a nice round 40 bomb groups. But we've got 3 divisions, 40 bomb groups, a number of wings and squadrons, thousands upon thousands of aircraft, all right? 8th Bomber Command, 8th Fighter Command, all of this built principally and ostensibly to take the fight to the Germans. And this is where they're based, all right? So all of East Anglia, you probably can't drive 10 or 15 minutes without running into an 8th Air Force base. Now I want to talk for a little bit about this gentleman here. And this gentleman is Major General Lawrence Sherman Cuter, one of the unsung heroes, I think, not only of the Air Force, but of World War II in general. West Point, class of 1927, he's one of the principal authors of the plan that they call the Air Plan that defeated Hitler, AWPD-1, Air War Planning Document -1. Right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he is a lieutenant colonel. He skips the rank of colonel. He is promoted to brigadier general at the age of 36. He becomes a commander of the 1st Bomb Group in 8th Air Force. Spats then grabs him, takes him down to North Africa, where he's a deputy commanding general of the North African Tactical Air Forces. And then Arnold grabs him back to kind of be Arnold's right-hand man back in D.C. Now, after the war, he goes on to a number of other commands: Military Air Transport Service, Pacific Air Forces. As a shout out to my Canadian brethren, he is the 2nd commander of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. In fact, he's almost Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the 1960s. The reason he's not is his principal competition is Curtis LeMay. Who are you going to pick to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force? Some guy you never heard of, or Curtis LeMay? Now, I mention Cuter because he is one of these people who approach strategic bombing with a very fervent belief. In all of those doctrinal classes that were taught in the interwar period, Cuter's the bombardment director for 4 years. I mean, this is the guy that teaches the rest of the Air Force about strategic bombing. Now, in advance of Arnold coming over for a post-D-Day visit to France, Cuter goes ahead of him, and Cuter's actually going to fly with the 8th Air Force on D-Day. And Cuter says, if Hermann Goering and all of the meteorologists of the Luftwaffe had prescribed ideal weather for the German Air Force to operate against our invading fleet, they could not have set up a more favorable conditions than what actually existed from the center of the channel to the invasion beaches on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Now, as we've mentioned, nearly 2,000 bombers from all 3 American air divisions, I don't want to use the word carpet bomb, but strategically bomb tactical targets right along the beaches. And as we've mentioned, they missed, all right? They delayed their bombing. As Steve mentioned earlier, the bombs dropped further inland, the naval gunfire went over, and so the German defenses, particularly at Omaha Beach, are untouched by the strategic bombers that morning. Now, also on the morning of the 6th, to also observe what's going on over the beaches, 2 P-38s launch out of Bovington Field. All right, and in those 2 P-38s are the commander of the 8th Air Force, Jimmy Doolittle, and his deputy, Major General Earl Partridge. Now, they accompany the 8th Air Force over the beaches that morning to observe the bombing mission. But what Doolittle wants to do is he doesn't just want to ride in one of the B-17s. Being in a fighter is going to allow him to get down and observe the damage that the bombers did, or in this case, did not cause. Now, the weather has hindered them from getting low, all right? So Doolittle and Partridge are both on a return flight heading back to England, not having observed the actual bombing missions. Partridge gets somewhat distracted at some point, and he's looking down internal to the aircraft. At the moment that he looks down to check some switches or something, Doolittle finds a hole in the clouds. So Doolittle breaks, wings over, down he goes. Partridge looks up, and the commander of 8th Air Force has disappeared. And Partridge is forced to go back, land at Bovington Field, and hey, where's Jimmy? I have no idea where Jimmy is. I lost him. And they don't know for several hours what's happened to Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle actually does drop through the clouds, turns back, and spends about an hour flying over the beaches. And one can imagine what he witnessed that morning. But, as has already been said, one of the things he witnessed was that the bombers that morning had bombed long and had not done what they had meant to do on the beaches that morning. Now, this is, of course, the D+1 conference. So my question as I was examining this was, so what did 8th Air Force do on D+1, D+2, D+25? My guess was that, well, all right, we've helped you get ashore, all bets are off, we're going back to do long-range strategic bombing. And this was, surprisingly, not the case. All right, all those spats was wholeheartedly against. And I should mention, as has been mentioned, in the months leading up to the actual invasion, the 8th Air Force had spent a considerable amount of time at the direction of Eisenhower against Spatz's wishes in attacking transportation targets, all right? Railroads, bridges, communication lines, anything that is going to help the Germans get troops to the beaches has been attacked by both the 8th and the 9th Air Force. But one would think, having done that, hey, we've helped you, we are going to go back to doing our strategic bombing now. This was not true. As we mentioned, 10,000, 13,000 sorties on D-Day. This is followed up on June 7th. This is followed up on June 7th by 40 different cities, 40 different targets, anywhere between 9 bombers and 100 bombers going against various cities. You could draw a line from Saint-Nazaire in the southwest almost directly along that TAC Photo Recce area, and this is where the Americans were bombing. In the weeks after D-Day, the 8th Air Force continued to pummel targets in and around the beaches, all done so that we could continue to help the troops get farther inland. So 8th Air Force kind of continued this more tactical, what Spatz would call a waste of bombing effort against German troop positions, our rail yards, anything that could help the Germans move forward. The 8th does not stop this until June 14th. So on June 14th, this is the first 8th Air Force raid that actually leaves France, all right? It goes back into Germany. And the 8th Air Force does not consider its job done until the 18th of June, and that's when the 8th Air Force makes what they called the first major mission to strategic targets since D-Day. Now, that does not mean that we, the Americans, the Allies, were not attacking strategic targets. We had an ace up our sleeve. And I love that the title of the book about this unit is called The Forgotten 15th, because the 15th Air Force is almost invariably overlooked, ignored. If you do an Amazon search looking for books about the 8th Air Force, you're going to get hundreds. Everything from from memoirs to Don Miller's Masters of the Air. The 15th is significantly smaller, all right? Fewer books have been written on that topic. But what happens on the night of 6 June is that Spatz sends a message to the 15th Air Force, and he tells them, from this day on, you need spend no further effort in the battle area. We will handle it from here. You go back and you keep working on the sources of military strength, and particularly air strength, deep in Germany. So in essence, at this point in the war, the Americans and the Allies have built a force that is capable of A, supporting the troops on the ground, and not necessarily what we would consider close air support today, but in attacking those nodes that kept the enemy from getting forward, while at the same time having 15th Air Force continue these deep strike operations. Now, I am an American air power historian. I have often been accused of ignoring my fellow RAF brethren and historians. So let's not forget that the 8th Air Force is not the only game in town. Operation Charnwood is preceded by one of the largest aerial bombardments in the Normandy campaign. But going forward, both American 8th Air Force and Bomber Command efforts help capture Cherbourg. They help capture Caen. Despite these victories, progress is slow, and you would think that I am going to end on the Operation Cobra, but I'm not, because there's a whole panel. We're going to keep you around, and we're going to talk Operation Cobra and the Normandy breakout here in the next session. So how effective were the supporting operations, what one might call a transportation plan, if you will? What did the 8th Air Force accomplish, and the 9th, in the months leading up to and in the weeks following the D-Day invasion? One German officer said, "The raids have caused the breakdown of all main lines of communications. The coast defenses have been cut off from the supply bases in the interior, producing a situation which threatens to have serious consequences. The transportation of supplies has been completely stopped. Large-scale strategic movement of German troops by rail is practically impossible at the present time, and it will remain so until these attacks from the air are stopped." In other words, the attacking of the transportation targets leading up to D-Day meant that the German army could get by train no closer than 100 miles from the advancing American forces. Now, one might ask, what role did the Luftwaffe play? As I mentioned, Kuter talks about Hermann Goering talks about the Luftwaffe prior to the attacks of D-Day, and mentions that if we had had weather, the Luftwaffe could have had no better weather than to respond to our invasion forces. But what role did the German Luftwaffe play? It became evident on D-Day for the first time that the Luftwaffe was a soundly defeated air force and participated in no significant ways to stem our invasion forces. By that point, Jimmy Doolittle had released his fighters to go against the German fighters. The German Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning air force. So, air power both contributed to the support landings in the lead up and the weeks following, and continued industrial high-altitude precision daylight bombing thanks to the work of the 15th. And now I believe we will have some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you both. I just have one question as chair before I turn it over to the audience. And as I was listening to these presentations, I was thinking about these two and the ones before that, and that emphasized just the enormity of this undertaking when we talk about D-Day and everything that comes after. And since we are the Airpower panel today, I was wondering if our two panelists would, since they're describing kind of two different functions of Airpower, if they would take a moment to just kind of talk about what made this all possible in the first place. Like, what had to happen from the 1920s into the 1930s and 40s for this to happen, and how do your two stories about Airpower figure in the broader sweep of what came before and what comes after?
You know, I think the important thing to remember is that no one makes decisions in the interwar period in bad faith. The decisions that were made and the ways in which people thought to use air power were all done with an eye towards shortening the war, ending it earlier, as I said, over, not through. Now, of course, this does not happen. As Sherry points out, we ended up creating Armageddon. But I also think it's important to point out that we have been doing land warfare since the dawn of human time. We have been doing sea warfare just about as long. But air warfare was a relatively new invention. In fact, everyone's post-World War I writings, the RAF, the U.S. Army Air Corps, they all admit that air power did very little in World War I. Now, it's cool. You get Eddie Rickenbacker dogfighting the Red Baron and stories like that, right? But what did air power actually contribute? Very little, and everyone admits to this. But in the aftermath, this is when all of these new doctrines are essentially invented. And so the doctrine is almost in a race with technology at the same time to see what air power is going to be capable of achieving in the World War II. Obviously, didn't know it was going to be there. What was going to happen in the next conflict. And so I think it's important to remember that these doctrines are kind of being created at the same time that air power itself is being developed.
It's actually kind of important to know what didn't happen in the 1920s and 30s when you think about the tactical air war in Europe. There isn't a strong doctrinal tradition of close air support, of interdiction, of airfield construction. And this allows or frees or makes unencumbered the men and organizations and institutions that confronted these problems in World War II. Someone like Pete Quesada has a relatively open mind about the problems in front of them. There are all sorts of doctrinal reasons steeped in strategic bombing and the control of airplanes and who's going to control airplanes to keep radios that can talk to each other out of individual tanks and individual airplanes, because you lose organizational and systemic control of those airplanes. There's all sorts of strategic doctrinal reasons not to do that. And he's just not encumbered with that. So I'd turn the question on its head a little bit. It's actually for the 9th. It's a little different for the 8th. But for the 9th and for the 12th and the other tactical air forces in World War II, it's almost a matter of what didn't happen in the pre-war years that allows a sort of a greater adaptability and flexibility to confront problems as they were and find solutions.
All right, please raise your hand if you have a question. First question will be towards the front.
So were there any strategy discussions regarding the long bombing of the coast prior to the invasion about the possibility of holding back a day and rerunning that coastline?
The 8th Air Force stuff? No, not in real time. I mean, the soldiers are ashore. The 8th Air Force is going to continue to support them a good deal, but there isn't much conversation about going back to the shore. The concerns about fratricide are so great with these heavy bombers on the coastline itself that built into their plans were delays on the pickle point. And the first planes that are going to come across the shore 30 minutes before the moment the first soldiers hit the shore, they're going to get to where they think their bomb point is, and then they're going to wait 30 seconds and then bomb. And they're flying perpendicular. And that's going to generally peel back until the last wave of these planes that are going to come across the shore 5 minutes before the first soldiers are designed to hit. This is an intricately choreographed thing, are only going to delay 5 seconds. But if you figure out that these planes are traveling at about 220 knots, and you figure out 30-second delay to 5-second delay, what happens is by design and because of concerns about fratricide, most of these bombs drop deep and beyond the bluffs at a place like Omaha. And that's a whole other story. But if I understand your question right, there isn't much question about the next day or the next day doing that same thing because the men of the ground forces are short. Did I understand your question? Could they run parallel to the coast and not perpendicular to the coast? Yes, but they can't get as many planes across. If you think of the pipeline, of a parallel pipeline along the coast that's going to run parallel, that's much smaller, and it takes much longer to get the same amount of airplanes across the beaches. When you're flying perpendicular, you can get more planes across. And there's some technical inside baseball here, but the radar that most of the planes have is a radar called H2X. And the H2X radar has greater deflection errors than range errors. Deflection error is right and left of your axis when you're dropping a bomb by radar. A range error is forward and back. But the radars they have are better, meaning less range errors front and back, and greater deflection errors. So if you're flying parallel, the deflection errors are the ones you're worried about, because those are the ones that are going to bomb either too far inland to matter or too far into the sea to hurt you. But the range errors when you're flying perpendicular, which are more limited with their radars, it's a better, there's less possibility for mistakes. So for both of those reasons, the decision was made to fly perpendicular to the beachhead. So too with Cobra later in the fight, and there's fratricide there, but for the same technical radar reasons.
And they did bomb that day, 6 June, using radar. They couldn't see. I mean, normally you would want to bomb visually. You would have your targets to line up with the Norden bomb site, might slightly increase your accuracy, but that particular morning they had to drop using radar, which was just another thing that added to the missed targets that morning.
We have another question towards the front near the aisle.
I'm curious, was there any Navy contribution? Naval air power contribution to this?
Not naval air power. The carriers are in the Pacific. The Marines are in the Pacific. There is a strong naval presence in the Channel, and their beach bombardment is critical at certain points. But the air power is U.S. Army Air Force's air power and British 2nd Tactical Air Force air power, British and Canadian. There's no, so it's a combined story. Combined meaning different nationalities, but less joint, meaning different, all the services participating.
Next question will be towards your right.
Is there any consensus of what part of the German war economy was most affected by strategic bombing? I mean, was it petroleum, aircraft factories, railroad marshaling yards, blah, blah, blah?
Yes. I don't think there's a consensus. I mean, I think we tend to argue over the last 80 years what would have been perhaps different if the strategic bombers had ever been able to focus on a single strategic target set. So we start off with these industrial targets. We're going to go after aircraft manufacturing. Okay, well now wait a minute. We're going to switch over and attack petroleum, oil, and lubricants. No, I want you to do more tactical. I want you to do more tactical stuff leading up to D-Day. No, stop that. Go against the V1 and the V2 rocket sites. So it has always struck me that the strategic bombers of the 8th Air Force don't get enough time from the perspective of the air commanders to really see what was done. Now, one thing that I will mention, I think one thing that there's a general consensus upon today, is that the German military had to husband a significant amount of manpower and material in Germany around these targets. I mean, this was manpower that could have been used other places. And I think we've argued for 80 years over what the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaigns were, and we'll probably argue for another 80 years over it as well. But I generally think the consensus now is that it all added together.
Next question is in the front to your left.
Could one of you speak to the importance of Base Air Depot 1 at RAF Burtonwood, just to the east of Liverpool?
Not specifically. I just don't have that level of granularity on it. Could you tell me a little bit more?
Also, no.
Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, it was the big maintenance and test flight airport. Apparently, two gentlemen, cousins from Osaka, Mississippi, the OTTs, where one of them was the base commander and the other one was the chief test pilot, and everything that had to get made airworthy again happened there because they couldn't do that much maintenance really at their own airfields.
Yeah, there were. So specifically, no. But now the bombers flew over along a ferry route, and they came intact. All of the fighter bombers are crated over on ships, and they all have to get re-put together again. And there are 3 different classes of maintenance, and it sounds like this is a Class A maintenance depot where they do the most involved, most detailed. They actually put these planes back together. They actually make these planes again. And in a Class C or B aircraft mishap, significant enough that it can't be repaired at a present base, but not a total loss. Those things have to be kind of taken apart enough to get on rail cars and go back to places like that. And kind of a theme since Rick Atkinson's talk last night, the sort of logistical and administrative and material maintenance stories about 1 million people fighting in a war. So it would be critical to those sorts of stories, but I'm sorry that I'm failing with any specifics about that particular place.
Yeah. I will say that, much as Tom and Rick echoed last night with regards to logistics and maintenance, this was one of the things I thought that the Masters of the Air Show did well that is often ignored, and that is the maintenance of patching up these bombers when they come back with, tails shot off and holes shot in the wings, and they really gave the maintainers their due diligence. And I've joked about this that people don't want to read books about logistics. People don't want to read books about maintainers. But the tooth to tail ratio, the men that kept the bombers in the air, is an epic story.
Next question will be over to your right.
How low could the medium and heavy bombers bomb? And with respect to D-Day, could they have gotten underneath the cloud cover so that they could have been more effective?
I'll let you cover the tactical and medium bombers. No, the high altitude bombers, they were going to bomb from 20, 25, 30,000 feet. Yeah, they were not, the B-17s, you were not going to see them get 1,500 feet below cloud cover. You don't see that until we begin the fire bombings of Japan in 44 and 45. And again, once LeMay goes out to the Pacific, LeMay rapidly, he's a great adapter, probably the greatest field commander the Air Force has ever had. And he is willing and able to get away from this strict adherence to doctrine. There's a lot of arguments. Again, I keep going back to it, but there's a great scene in Masters of the Air where the Americans and the British are arguing over high-altitude precision daylight bombing versus night area bombing. And I apologize, of course, the American punches the British guy out in the argument. But it's LeMay who really gets over this idea that even with the B-29, no, we don't have to be at 20,000 feet. We're going to take these things in low. And so you don't see that until much later in the war. I don't think it would have ever been considered to try to fly the B-17s at under 1,500 feet on June 6th. 1,500, 2,000 feet. I mean, it was a very overcast day.
Utah's a slightly different story. The 8th Air Force is supporting the Omaha beachhead. The Utah beachhead, up on the Cotentin Peninsula, and there's not a map in the present, but you see how that coastline changes. And to the perpendicular or parallel question, there is one beach where the bombers come in parallel to the beach, and that's Utah, because they all got to move in the same direction because there's too many planes in the air and they can't have cross accesses at work. They're all flying this way, and then they're all going to go that way or that way and return. And so they're actually parallel. The medium bombers, the 9th Air Force Medium Bomber Command, led by a guy named General Orville Anderson. At Utah, the cloud cover is 6 to 8 broken, 6,000 to 8,000 broken. They're supposed to fly at about 14,000. You know, little smaller planes, little smaller bombs, a little different mission set, and flying parallel. And he makes a decision early on the morning of D-Day, and he doesn't tell anybody. He doesn't ask anybody senior to him, but he tells the people that are working for him, you're going to fly underneath the clouds. And they say, how low? Get as high as you can, but you're underneath the clouds. So they come in somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, parallel to the beach. And Utah is no soldier knows what they're going to meet when they hit the far shore. I want to be careful here. But the Utah beachhead is not as difficult to secure as the Omaha beachhead. And part of that is because of the effectiveness of the close air support that day. It's the medium bombers flying lower, flying parallel, coming in 6,000 to 8,000 feet, but under the clouds. But the 8th Air Force just doesn't have any. Coming back to this, I feel sorry for the bombers asking to do something that they're not really trained to do. So that's that story.
Next question, we're in the front.
This isn't in particular to D-Day, but it's a more fundamental question about the numbered air forces. And you were saying the 9th was in North Africa. Could you, and I understand that the 15th formed up, was it the 9th and the 12th that came together to form the 15th? Or
well,
I'm confused about the origination of the 15th. Thank you.
Well, little is more confusing about what we call heraldry in the United States Air Force. 8th Air Force is relatively easy. It is established on this date in 1942. It exists in perpetuity until through today. But different lineage honors and heraldry. So, 9th might exist for a little while, but then its history is going to be given over to 12th or 15th. So that there are a lot of shifting and moving parts. By the way, we're going to add on to that something like there's going to be a North African Air Force. Under that is going to be the North African Strategic Air Force, the North African Tactical Air Force. Under that is going to be the British and American organization. So it's easy to get lost in those very, very, very rapidly.
And when you're looking at the constituent parts of any given numbered Air Force, they can come from different areas. The whole numbered Air Force story, as the Army Air Forces go from about 160,000 people to 2 million people across 18 months in 1940 to 1942, they need a new bureaucratic scaffolding, a skeleton to sort of drape all of those people on, and they come up with the NAF structure. And that doesn't exist before 1941. And there's supposed to be 20 numbered air forces. Not all of them stand up. The first 4 are training air forces in the 4 quadrants of the United States. The 5th is a designed composite air force, George Kenney's Air Force in Australia, and so on and so on and so on. In Europe, you have the 9th Air Force in Africa early on. Those units generally stay in North Africa. The name, the 9th Air Force, goes to England. But the units that stay in North Africa become the 12th Air Force. And that's the tactical air force in the Mediterranean. The 15th Air Force is built from whole cloth as the strategic air force in the Mediterranean theater, Italy. And then the analogs are the 8th and the 9th in Europe and that kind of stuff. Which was the one that was, which NAF was supposed to go to China and went to North Africa instead. The Air Force the NAF that went to North Africa is the 9th Air Force. So I'll intuit it was that. the Air Force in China becomes the 14th Air Force when they pull Chennault's Flying Tigers, that was an all-volunteer group, and at the time, super, super secret. I mean, it's a famous unit right now, but we had American forces fighting the Japanese alongside Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists well before Pearl Harbor, and that was a scandal waiting to happen if the media got a hold of it. And therefore, when they pull Chennault's people back into the regular Air Force, that becomes the 14th.
Next question is to your right.
Can you speak to the psychological impact on the Germans as they're seeing and hearing this massive something that's coming at them, even before hearing a bomb go off? It had to be stunning.
I think it's really interesting that, you know, we don't actually discover the "Keep Calm and Carry On" poster until many decades later. But this was a very British idea of, we're just going to maintain that they can come over and they can bomb London, they can bomb the countryside. You know, we will never ever give up. Conversely, at the same time, both American and British bomber leaders, while I don't think that the morale of the people was ever explicit, we are going to bomb people. We're going to. The morale effects were always considered a secondary effort. We're going to hit the industrial targets. We're going to dehouse the workers, however you want to phrase it. But the morale effects were always considered a secondary objective. And we, the Americans and the British, never came to grips with the idea that people under the bombs have a remarkable ability to continue their daily lives, to continue functioning, to I don't want to say you probably never get used to it, but you figure out how to deal with it. And it was interesting that the British were very, stiff upper lip. The Germans can bomb us as much as they want. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. But don't worry, when we bomb the Germans, it's going to cause panic and distrust, and it's going to bring the system down. So I've always found that dichotomy very interesting.
Next question is going to be to the far right of the room.
Actually, he sort of asked the question that I intended to ask, but I guess if I could ask you to maybe go a little further in depth, so that with regards to the what the Germans called the terror bombings in places like Hamburg and Dresden. So what you're saying basically is that the Allied command never really, they never said that we were going to intentionally target German civilians in order to destroy morale on the home front. It was just sort of we're going to attack these industries, and if civilians are demoralized in the process, then go ahead.
Let me make it clear that there are targets throughout Germany. Messerschmitt plants, petroleum, oil, and lubricant plants, the V1 and the V2 rocket sites. That being said, Berlin itself was singled out. And amazingly enough, Spatz actually had a problem with this. Berlin itself was considered the target. It doesn't matter really what you bomb in Berlin. What matters is that you were bombing Berlin. I don't think you're going to find a piece of paper from any air leader where they write down and said, yeah, tend to kill as many of the German people as humanly possible. I think when you get down to it, there were targets, but everyone knew that there were going to be kind of secondary or tertiary effects, and the will of the people was certainly up there. Does that kind of answer your question? Do you want to?
As it relates to the battlefield experience of German soldiers, I mean, it's the civilian aspect of that, and I don't have anything to add or modify to Brian's excellent response to you. Germans are terrified of Allied air power, and they want to know where in the world the Luftwaffe is in a place like Normandy. Every time there's a plane overhead, they've got about a 99.97%, I'm making that statistic up, but I'm probably not far off, chance that it's an American or British and not a friendly. There's complete air superiority in that area. The Luftwaffe, for instance, on June 6th, liars figure and figures lie. I have seen anywhere from 213 to 264 Luftwaffe sorties flown that day, vice about 13,000 Allied sorties. They're just not there. On the occasion that ground forces would have some frustration with Anglo-American air support, and that happened, and there was fratricide, and there was some tension, this would, on one of these instances, Pete Quesada, who's got great relationships with Omar Bradley and Joe Collins in particular, the last letter that Omar Bradley ever writes, Pete Quesada, shortly before Omar Bradley dies in the 1980s, is signed, Love Omar, among a generation of men that just didn't, sign letters that way. At one point, Quesada goes and finds some German POWs that have been interrogated and brings them in front of Joe Collins and Omar Bradley at a dinner in the Bocage country in July 14th or 15th, and has them recount to these American ground generals their feelings about American air power and close air support there. And just as a kind of a way to, the Germans are terrified of it, the German soldiers.
Next question is right in the front.
Earlier today, they were talking about the lack of equipment and supplies and that sort of thing. Was the air supplies, did that have anything to do with right after the D-Day invasion, or was it because of the horrible condition of the airfields that they couldn't support something like that?
I don't know.
Okay, I'm just asking, was there any support from the air to help supply the troops and stuff with the ammunition, that sort of thing, or was this just strictly bombing at this stage?
Some very high demand material is flown to the far shore by airplane, but it almost all comes by ship. Most of the airplanes are flying guns and bullets and bombs and people airdropping. The Troop Carrier Command in the 9th Air Force, after the airborne drops, generally go back to England on trash hauling missions between English bases here and there and the other places. The one exception I can think of, and there's others, a microwave early warning radar system, which was a bulky system, but it was very unique. There was only 8 of them in the entire American inventory in 1944. And the microwave on this MEW radar set was very tight, and so it could get a very good picture of an airplane. And they needed it on the far shore, and that was flown in a dozen or so airplanes. And we put together in Normandy June 10th, June 12th, something like that.
We're going to stay in the front. We're going to go a little to the right.
Not sure if this is within your bailiwick, but in the United States, we hear about the Roads of the River Tour and stuff like that. How many planes were turned out? I know it has to be thousands, but how many planes were being turned out each week, and how many manufacturing plants were there?
Yeah, they've if you go look at that, the B-20, the B-24 over there, it's got, there were actually more Liberators built than Flying Fortresses, but the B-17 gets all the love. I think simply because when it sits on the ground, it points to the sky. It's got the tri-landing gear, and it looks like a beautiful air, and that sits very low to the ground, is very boxy. But we built more B-24s than we did B-17s. But both of them were in the neighborhood of 18,000 throughout the war. So you can very rapidly, of course, they're not losing them as fast as they're building them, but the loss rate of the 8th Air Force, particularly in late 1942 throughout 1943, is absolutely horrific. We lose more airmen over the skies of Europe than we do Marines in the Pacific. Which is a figure that no matter how many times I say it, it's hard to come to that conclusion. So we build the hell out of them. I mean, like you said, I mean, it's every hour, every day, there are hundreds and hundreds of these things rolling off the assembly lines at 6 to 10 plants throughout the United States of America. and then the Herculean effort of flying them from the assembly plant to an embarkation area, probably by the Women Air Force Service pilots, and then flown over into Europe before being integrated into one of the three air divisions. But we're talking for the B-24 and the B-17 alone, we're talking 30, 35, 40,000 aircraft total.
Next question.
So if I remember right, in Masters of the Air, Crosby had a little chemical assistance staying awake, and then he crashed, and that's why he slept through D-Day. Can you speak to the chemical assistance that was present in the Air Force?
Yeah, that's real. I don't know how prevalent it is. There's a terrific book by a guy named Mark Wells that talks a lot about pilot fatigue, pilot resilience. Don Miller has done a lot about just the physical challenges of flying an unpressurized aircraft at 25,000, 30,000 feet. Next time you're on Delta Airlines, or pull up that little screen, and when you're at 30,000 feet, look at what the outside temperature is. Frostbite and those sorts of things. And this was all at the human edge of understanding psychologically, and so that's a tremendous story. This stuff still, depending upon what's at stake, and you'll still see this stuff today under very careful medical provisions and guardrails, but it was pretty common, and so was whiskey rations. One of the problems they have in debriefing, particularly in the 8th Air Force, is, hey, just one whiskey ration. We got to get these. We got to get them talking enough, but not talking so much that I can't. 3 whiskey rations, and I can't trust anything that a pilot says. And you got to start with about 40% trust to begin with a pilot. I mean, it's all.
Yeah,
it happened.
There's another great book about I think it's Superstition in Air Warfare, and it talks about all of the various different coping mechanisms, everything from lucky rabbit's feet to self-medication, to alcohol dependency. You got to remember that we talk about B-17s or B-24s going on milk runs, but there are those missions where we lose 35 out of 200 bombers, and one squadron may lose over half of the bombers in that particular squadron. And so these are guys that you have trained with and lived with, and then therefore you don't want to get to know the replacements, because their life expectancy is very low. If you get something above 5 to 10 missions, you've got a better chance of survival. But there are still people that get up in 20, 30 on their second tour missions and still end up getting shot down. So yeah, there was a lot of self-medication because from 1942 to the landing in 1944. I mean, I'm not skipping over Sicily and Italy, but the 8th Air Force kind of considered themselves the only game in town, right? Like we are the ones taking the fight to Hitler and the enemy right now, and so high casualty rates led to high alcoholism, post-traumatic stress disorder, we'd call it today, all sorts of issues.
Our last question will be to your right in the center.
Yeah, it's just since we've been talking about air superiority the whole time, towards the end of the war, you had the advent or the introduction of the jet. If the jet had been introduced maybe a month earlier, would it have been more of an adverse situation for how the war carried forward? Or was it just way too late for it to have any effect in the war at all?
I think too late. Even if it had been introduced earlier, look, jet warfare and piston-driven airplanes, dogfights, it's really two different things. So the Germans didn't even realize what they were dealing with in trying to put this thing into operation. Yeah, it's faster. It's way faster than a P-51. Its turning circle is also much larger. So I don't think that the Germans, even if it had been introduced earlier, it would have had much of an impact in the grand scheme of things.
I don't disagree, but I think the question of too early or too late is a different question of, was there ever going to be enough of them? And I don't think it was ever going to be enough of them, whether they came a month earlier, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 2 months later, because of the engineering and state of the German economy at that time. I think the bigger issue is there's never going to be enough of them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Hutchinson, Tom Hughes, and Brian Lastly.
Thanks, Rob, Tom, and Brian. Can't even think of a better venue for a discussion like this. Most of the time I was sitting there looking over my head. We are now going to take another break, another author book signing right on over here to your right. But please be back in your seats at 3:30 for our final panel of the day.